Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So, two things we need to acknowledge. First, we didn't do an episode yesterday, and we forgot to give people a heads up. So we're
Yes.
sorry about that
Sorry
void that we created into your lives.
to our fan base.
And
Yeah.
the other thing is, you were all excited about how the number of the episode kind of matched the number of the day, but because we missed the day,
we screwed that up. I know, it's terrible.
Sorry, Dan.
Oh well, I'll get over it.
To introduce ourselves before we introduce the topic, I'm Mark Van Stuink. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And good morning, Kathleen, and everybody else that's watching / listening.
Today we're talking about big numbers, like even bigger than 95.
Way bigger.
Yeah, and how we're generally incapable of processing large numbers.
Yes.
In any real meaningful way, and what that does. So, like, the United States, we're approaching 200,000 COVID deaths that we know of.
Yep.
And there's approaching 1 million worldwide, and it's going to keep growing. But
but nobody cares.
Our empathy is not growing in proportion to those numbers at all. In fact, empathy is decreasing.
Right.
That's what's I've number of studies out there. Let's see, one of them from someone from the University of Oregon. I was just reading today from Paul Slovic that actually the larger the number, the less you care. It's not that you just kind of only can go up to 100, and then after 100 you're like, well, that maxed out. It's like, well, no, it starts declining, and so the bigger the number, the less you care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And, as you said, there have been studies on this, quite a few studies on this. And it actually seems to, people have posited that there's an evolutionary approach to this, that it actually is good to kind of numb out after a certain point, because otherwise you'd get like so scared and overwhelmed that you couldn't function. Also, that the smaller numbers help you to identify it with yourself, right? Because we're just one, and I'm always, the center of my universe. And so if I can identify with one other person, right, then that helps me to think about a survival strategy if I think there's a particular threat to my particular life, right? Whereas something that's going to like kill everyone, it's like that's probably so big that I actually don't even really sort of need to worry about it.
It's good to have a connection with the individuals in front of you. So I get that there's like a reason. Like one of the things they talked about in this study is if you're showing a picture of one starving child and you're showing a picture of two starving children, you're still more likely to give money to support the one instead of the two. So even though that's not abstract, like it's still two. It's just emotionally we're for whatever reason we connect more on a one-to-one level. Mm-hmm. And that's probably a good thing when it comes to how we in relationships, right? To be able to be present. But like once we start getting into politics, though, this tendency towards the individual in politics tends to be the way that libertarian conservatives tend to think, and that gets to be disastrous.
Right. Yeah. We've got a comment already
from Mark Tibbles. I posit that one way to keep from being desensitized is to imagine the numbers as a town or city. For instance, the numbers of U.S. deaths is the same as the entire population of the city of Lexington, Kentucky, becoming a ghost town overnight. That's a powerful image for me. I think that seems like a good strategy because you know your city and you care about it. Maybe you don't even care about the people. Like, so with the protests that have happened in Minneapolis, you hear a lot about businesses. And so my assumption is that people, they still care about those people in the abstract, but they feel it that they can't go to their favorite restaurant anymore. Now that might seem stupid, to like on paper, but it makes sense that you care about what you've emotionally connected to. So that strategy seems to make sense.
Yeah, I mean, and it is interesting that you will hear people do all sorts of strategies to try to get people to connect with these large numbers, right? So, Mark, you're positing one, another one recently, right? Because we just had September 11th. There were all these people saying, well, you care so much about all these people that died. The number of people that have died of COVID is as if there was, a September 11th every day for, I don't remember, 60 days or something, like planes flying into buildings every day for 60 days. And you will see, people employ these strategies to try to get people to connect, to try to manipulate, and it's interesting you bringing up the protest thing, because we've actually seen this a lot in Minneapolis, that politicians will get up there and they will talk about one business owner, right? Like, the other day there was a city council person that was like, my friend, the Pakistani grocery store owner, they got their business destroyed, right? And so now that they then use that to say, okay, now all these terrible protests that are happening, right? And so there are all these techniques that we employ to try to get people to be empathetic, which again is sort of interesting. It does also tell us about the fact that, we sort of our empathy is somewhat limited to begin with. I mean, to me, that's one of the things behind this.
We need to accept and grapple with that, and not like a lot of people will just try to act as though somehow they're the immune one. Like somehow they feel 200,000 deaths. Like, you don't feel 200,000 deaths, not really. No. It's like, with the George Floyd thing, a lot of people were upset that why is this guy? People suddenly care about this guy. He's not worthy. Like, that's the conservative take. Videos and images of one man getting choked out to death, it connects with people on a visceral level in a way that, unfortunately, a lot of other deaths, because they seem more abstract, don't. But this is we can all imagine what that feels like.
Right.
Because we've all experienced the choking sensation. We've seen the images. Even with Breonna Taylor, there's some misogyny going on here, but like we heard about it. It's just harder to imagine it and put ourselves in that position. But it makes sense that this would be a tipping point. And part of the problem isn't that that this is a bad thing, that our human tendency towards connections and emotional connections one-on-one and smaller scale, that's not a bad thing. It's how it's used against us that's nefarious. And I feel like Americans are uniquely prone to this, because other societies, they have the same biological conditioning, but they have better numeracy skills. Like, they understand numbers better. Like, United States is one of the worst developed countries in numeracy. Yes. Like, we're numerically illiterate, basically, compared to other places. We don't encourage systemic thinking. We don't have a strong social impulse. Like, part of the driving narratives of our society are uniquely individualistic in a way you're not going to find in most other countries, with the exception of maybe like Australia or something. But basically, we're worse in all these ways. And then we encourage callousness in a lot of other. So what little empathy we have is being attacked. Our inability to understand abstractions is being exploited deliberately, like the way Dan used one example. But the conservatives are really good at this. Like, we need to acknowledge that. Somehow Democrats and people left of center, which are not the same thing as Democrats, I'm referring them as two different groups of people. We tend to think that if we give out statistics, that somehow people will be like, you know what? Now that once we're at 300,000 people dead of COVID in the United States, then people will wake up. Right. Like, people actually kind of think that way. Meanwhile, conservatives are like, I was unable to visit my grandma because of COVID and she died, and I never got to say goodbye. And they'll tell stories like that. And one connects more than the other.
Well, or the GOP will find the 5 black people in America that like Donald Trump, and they'll put them up in their convention, and they'll go, "See, the GOP likes black people." Right. So it's the individuals and the individual stories. All right, more comments coming in.
Kathleen writes, excuse me, I'm reading Woodward's book, and my white pastor friends are telling me that we shouldn't say Black Lives Matter because all lives matter, and that I should stop listening to the news about the virus because that's giving me negative attitude. I feel like banging my head against the nearest wall.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why the nearest wall? All walls matter.
All walls matter. Yeah.
No, and this, okay. I mean, this connects this idea of Black lives. It's somehow an abstraction that these white people feel like is against them individually. Like that's the reaction going on. And again, it's in the form of emotional manipulation, which is, I find hilarious all the time because conservatives are convinced they're the logical ones.
Yeah. Well, and and this is a very similar sort of phenomenon, right? Because when you start talking about, there were 10 million Africans that were killed or brought over and enslaved, or there were, 10 million Native Americans that were killed, and it's that same phenomenon, right? It's this big, huge number, and there's kind of a numbness to it, and you can't really get that. And, you just go, well, this black guy I saw on TV looked like a criminal, so all lives matter, and this is dumb, right? And so there's that juxtaposition again where the big number just kind of vanishes into the ether, doesn't really mean anything.
Well, yeah, and then because of that, this is common, not just among conservatives, I'm picking on them, but I feel like a lot of us are prone to this. So we extrapolate from the one to the many. So the example of, I knew a black guy in our neighborhood, and he was always trying to steal from me, which I see a lot on Nextdoor app. Therefore, black people have a problem. Black people have a problem of thievery, like that kind of. From the one to the many is how racism kind of exists at a kind of a core level, how it connects to systemic issues. And so that's what happens. Like if you can't think of the big number, you just extrapolate what you know outward. Right. And then what we need is to be able to develop the habits that allow us to do the reverse.
Right. Now, then, of course, you have the other phenomenon, which is huge right now during the pandemic, which is you just try to pretend that the big number isn't real.
Yes.
Right. So there is this whole thing going on where, the Fox News Trump crew realize that even if we can't connect to it emotionally, like the big number sounds pretty bad.
It's scary.
And they do get that. And so the simple thing is, well, the big number is just fake. And that is the thing about big numbers, because you can't sort of verify them easily, right? I can't go down to my local hospital and find 200,000 dead bodies. Then you can just say, well, it's just not real, right? It's just fake, and yeah, maybe I know one person that died of COVID, but that's just one person. People die of car wrecks all the time, right?
Yeah. Or it's fake or exaggerated. So, now we get into like things like Holocaust denialism, because it's impossible to see, 6, 7, 8 million dead people. You can't see that. You can see a few pictures. And so you think, well, maybe it's just those few pictures are all that happened. Like there's also this other phenomenon of pitting big numbers against each other. 200,000 died. Well, lots of people died of the flu in the past. Those are similar numbers. So it's the same thing.
Right. Yep. All right. We've got our comments here.
Series writes, honestly, U.S. people are numbed up, as in freezed up. It also makes us catharsis and trauma porn junkies.
Right. Which drives me bananas. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a really interesting point is that sort of numbness in general, then you have all of these feelings and sublimated experiences, thoughts, stuff in your body, and there's got to be some way to have some kind of catharsis and resolution of all of that. And so, you're just like, yeah, let's just go watch stuff blow up and people shoot each other all the time. And there's a certain level of catharsis about that. And then I can go back to my life where I'm totally numb. So,
Gus writes, this limited empathy for larger groups is, I'm sure, why people shut down around unhoused people. The larger the homelessness problem, the less we seem to give a crap.
Yeah,
I think that's entirely true. Back in the day when I used to get invited to churches to talk about, homelessness because of the Mennonite worker. And I remember this guy asking me afterwards, like, when I walk to work, he lived in a major city. There's so many homeless people. I don't know how to help them. So I've trying to figure out what can I do for all that. So I thought an idea I started is I carry a clicker, and every time I see a homeless person, as I click it, and when it reaches 20, I give that person money. And I was like, oh. I mean, he's trying to deal with the abstraction of it. I'm like, well, this is where we have to lean into our mental conditioning or the way we're built a little bit, because that just adds to the depersonalization. So I encourage him, like, well, what happens? Have you ever noticed if these are the same people every day? Because odds are the homeless people you're experiencing are from around there. So get to know, look in their faces and see which ones you recognize, and then try to develop a relationship and go from there instead of just clicking and counting and giving every 20th person $1 or whatever. So this is kind of, how do we deal with these abstractions? This personalist response of noticing an individual at a time and leaning into that relationship. If that's how we're built anyways, we might as well do that instead of be shut down by the big numbers. Heather writes, herd mentality about herd immunity. Well stated.
Yes.
Bo writes, interestingly enough, I was talking with my neighbor briefly about Black Lives Matter. She mentioned that she emphasized all lives matter because it didn't matter to her what color someone's skin is. She's black and I'm white. Yeah, it's interesting. It happens.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, and this is something that, again, a certain segment of white America loves to parade, black folks that certainly in public, basically want to say that, racism doesn't really exist. And, we could have a whole conversation about that. I mean, the internalized process, the issue of safety, the issue of, how people of color and black folks have to code switch and, talk very nicely to white folks. And I mean, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot going on there.
Social conditioning and trauma can make people think all kinds of things. That's why poor white rural Americans work against their best interests all the time. It's because they've believed the stories about themselves. Of course, it's all very complicated. Again, this is the law of big numbers. Like when you see statistics like, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. And then we say, well, all white evangelicals voted for Trump. Like there's still that 19%. And even within the 81%, everyone has their own complex psychological reasoning. This is the challenge is we have to be able to think about the big numbers and how it affects us, but we can't lose sight of the individual interactions we have in relationships. And and in our interactions with people, we can't lose sight of the larger trends. And this being able to have multiple thought processes, individual and systemic at the same time, is really, really hard.
And that's the Yeah, I mean that is absolutely the challenge. The ability to both think big and think small at the same time is just not something that we're trained to do, and we don't value that. You know, as you were saying before, there's all kinds of American cultural things that work against that, right? And so the ability to be present to the people who are in front of you and say, yes, that's important, and doing what I do to the people right in front of me is important, and I can't forget about what's happening in the big systemic world. That's also important. For some reason, holding those two things seems to be a uniquely American lack of capacity to do that.
Kathleen writes, there's a method that trumps madness. The more he lies, the less people care that he lies.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. And he's, you know, he's compelling. I mean, I think he's not a great person at all. And I think he's inane, but there's an emotional compellingness to him that feels cathartic to a lot of people. And I get it. Like, I really do. Like, it feels good when someone bullies the people you don't like.
Right.
And then, but at the same time, he'll do that and then switch to, like, does this thing talking about these individuals that he knows and the struggles they have. I mean, Bernie Sanders got this in his campaign, by the way, and which is one of the reasons I was sad about Sanders not going further, is because people act like he failed, but this out of nowhere guy called himself a socialist was able to understand messaging, clarity, naming the actual enemy, and then he started telling all these individual stories. He'd meet with people and talk about healthcare individually and share their individual stories. So he was trying to hack our psychology in a way, but for the left in a way that doesn't ever really happen in our society.
No, the Democrats are unbelievably bad at this in general.
Gus writes, your story of clicker guy is going to give me an aneurysm. It was good knowing you, Gus.
Yes. I hope it's in your finger, not in your brain.
Yeah,
or your.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that the thing to me about that story is that, yeah, on a certain level, it's sort of gross and weird, and on another level, I also understand it, right? Because there is this frustration that people have with, okay, what do I do about something?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and in an individualistic society, right, where it is so hard to connect with groups, with social policy, with movements that affect change, right? When you get this sense of like, okay, I want to connect with this big issue, there then follows almost immediately this feeling of, well, I don't even know what to do. Like, I'm not part of a union anymore. There isn't really a party that's working on this. I don't know a group in my town that's effective. So then people start coming up with all their own funny things to do. And yeah, I mean, there's something very weird about that solution. But look, at least this guy was spending some time paying attention to the problem. I mean, most other people just tune it out altogether.
Yeah.
So I do think that we have to recognize that part of this phenomenon, right? I mean, yes, humans are hardwired to it, but as we're saying, part of this phenomenon is that our society also beats out any attempt to have compassion for these big numbers. It beats it out of us.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's just no, what is the social process for engaging? Well, you can vote once every 2 or 4 years or something, but what happens in between? Where is the organizing? Where is the effort that I can do? I mean, it's really, really hard to connect to any of that.
Well, and when we have a reaction to a systemic problem, our society in general tends to lean towards lifestyle changes, which I I mean, I've made a bunch of lifestyle changes, so it's not all bad, but I think it's more formative than effective, generally speaking. But what a lot of people do is they live in that space. They think, I'm going to fix the environment through recycling. I'm like, no, you're not. That's one thing you can do that should lead to other things. But then our society, like you hear from corporations even, like, the reason we have environmental problems is because of your choices. I'm like, well, no, that's not how it works either. So this gaming of the difference between system and individual happens all the time. And comment from Ed ties in, we live through the TV. Who has a TV anymore? Which can cause us glaze over. I wonder what effect it has had on history. There's a pretty compelling documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma right now that I encourage. It has a very neoliberal posture, but it gets the information right. And one of the things that it talks about is how, advertising on social media, all it has to do is tweak a tiny bit of an individual's behavior, because then the sum total effect on that is easy to measure. It's big. So they can ratchet up, like, we need to destabilize the government in Costa Rica. They can tweak things through, someone can buy ads, and then you can see a visible effect. And so the way that we can be manipulated on this very tiny ways individually has big repercussions and that we're not aware of. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it's easy to manipulate us because now there's new layers of abstraction between us. Like back in the day, you just either knew people or didn't. Yeah. Like you saw them physically or you didn't. And that was it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think about, Ed, in relation to your comment, it was the Vietnam War. So, I mean, I remember as a kid, and my parents every night would watch Walter Cronkite. And, I remember every night you get the death count, on TV, Americans killed and wounded, Viet Cong killed and wounded. It was always very interesting. The number of Viet Cong was always way more than the number of Americans, which I, often started to think, like, are they just doing that to, like, show that we're winning all the time? But there was sort of this endless march of these numbers. And there was this sense of numbing about that. You just, after a while, you didn't even know how many numbers this was or how big this was. And, and yeah, I mean, people, we just space it out, basically because it's really too overwhelming, especially when we're powerless and we can't do anything about it.
A couple more comments. Ed also points to other media inputs to internet, radio, TV. It's hard to feel we have any control over the environment. Kathleen writes, Trump summed up the apathy with the phrase, "It is what it is."
Right. Yeah.
One of the practices, I think, that doesn't cure anything, but the metta, or the loving kindness meditation. For those, this isn't in the Christian tradition really, but I don't see why not. It fits really well with it. It's this idea that you have this attentive prayer for yourself, and you start thinking about people who you love and acquaintances, and you start thinking out towards, like, and allow your conscious meditation to start encapsulating larger numbers of people and people that you don't like at all. And so it's just as a way of starting to think about it. And the reason I find it compelling is, like, I'm convinced that the reason I'm weird in my family, why I'm the weird leftist systems person, not exclusively, but most of my family isn't like this, is because when I was 14, I had a mystical experience where I felt like I was the suffering of the world. Like I felt like I was experiencing the world's suffering in a way that was not abstract to me. And so I connected to people outside myself in a way that I would never have been able to imagine on my own. So it made a connection. And I think we can develop practices that cause us to be attentive to people that are not in front of us and to start caring about it. And I think that, again, like Facebook ads can affect us in small ways that have big repercussions. I think so too. These sorts of practices can shift our behavior in small ways that have big repercussions.
Yeah, and a lot of what contemplative practice is about, which is very countercultural in our religious world, is it's about connecting to the suffering of the world. and so that is what is kind of the cure to the big number numbness, because your capacity for empathy for larger and larger groups of folks increases, and so now you are actually concerned about that. But it is, and we can have these spontaneous mystical experiences. And then we also continue to engage in practice that sort of deepens and stabilizes that.
Another practice I think that's helpful towards this end is cultivating curiosity towards other cultures and places, which I've learned a lot from my wife, Amy, because she's always loved other cultures and places. And I've been kind of indifferent instinctively, but like now I care about Ethiopia and Oromia because of these connections that she's cultivated. And I wouldn't, when I was a kid, you remember hearing about the famine and all these people dying in Ethiopia. I'm like, they show the pictures of the one child to make you feel bad. And I'm like, oh, that makes me feel bad. I'm going to shut this out. So I pushed away any sort of connection, but you can cultivate caring through curiosity. Yeah. Mark writes, to paraphrase, one death is a tragedy. 1 million deaths is a statistic.
Right.
Yeah. Patricia writes, compassion training, which just to plug, Patricia often does self-compassion training. So look her up if you're interested. Compassion training has been eye-opening, as much of what passes as care for others is really a survival mechanism. My survival depends on pleasing others. Self-compassion is quite revolutionary and challenging. Counters our acculturation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and so she's got another comment.
In mindful self-compassion, we ask, if you can't be compassionate, can you be curious?
Yeah, and curiosity, this is, the basic contemplative kind of question, right, is what are you noticing? Mm-hmm. You're beginning to become curious about yourself, about the world around you, about what is going on out beyond you, and so much of what we and we're like crazy right now in relation to the pandemic. So much is about shutting down curiosity, right? So much of the yelling, so much of the people deciding that they're experts on epidemiology, even though they failed high school biology, et cetera, et cetera. So much of what that's about is shutting down curiosity, and that helps with the numbness. And it not only is personally detrimental, actually, in the long run, but certainly we're seeing that it's very socially detrimental. So we encourage you all to be curious.
One last little thing, and maybe we can talk more. We've talked about this before, but it might be worth revisiting. This is one of the dangers of spiritual practice, is that you can do it in a way that bypasses things. We've talked about before,
self-absorption,
where you're using it as a way of encouraging the numbness, rather than spiritual practice, which allows you to actually grow in your capacity to feel more pain. Like, if you think about it, your ability to be present and curious to more people in deeper ways results in greater discomfort and more pain, which is unpleasant, but you grow in your capacity, because to the extent to which you can experience more of the suffering of others is the extent to which you can grow in your capacity for love. And so that's the goal, not to feel calm all the time, which is how this, again, even our spiritual practices are being hacked into being individualistic things that encourage numbness and apathy. Last comment, we're past time. Dan might not even realize it, but when in an email I told him about this horrible neuro disease I've got and asked him about how to be useful to the world, he said, you take care of yourself, and if you have any energy you have left, you can help someone else. That has helped me tremendously.
Oh, good. Oh, hey, listen, so that we don't mess up our listeners again, we actually need to skip tomorrow as well.
What?
Sorry.
Sorry
to drop that on you.
Well,
so
we'll
be back on Friday. Yeah.
It gives us more time to marinate in greatness before giving people a feast on Friday.
Yes, and big numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So go big or go home.
See y'all on Friday.
Bye. Thank you.